The world presents as composed of objects. This presentation dictates interaction. It allows for navigation. The assumption underpinning this presentation is that these objects possess an inherent essence. This essence is understood to be stable, unchanging, a bedrock upon which experience is built. It is the presumed foundation of what is perceived. The feeling of solidity arises from this assumption. The perception of a table, for instance, suggests a thingness, a continuous presence independent of observation. This perceived independence allows for predictable interaction. A table can support weight, a chair can be sat upon. Such interactions would be impossible without the implicit understanding of an enduring presence. This assumption proves itself useful. It permits differentiation. It establishes boundaries. The ability to identify an object, to label it, chair or tree, is crucial for functional operation. Recognition precedes action. Action relies on recognition. The continued repetition of sensory data, reinforcing similar form across varying conditions, strengthens the belief in this enduring essence. Language, as a system of categorization, further consolidates the notion of fixed identity. However, persistent scrutiny alters this perception. Examination reveals the constant flux within what is designated an object. Molecular vibration is undeniable. Chemical reactions occur continuously. Wear and tear accrues relentlessly. These processes fundamentally alter the composition of the perceived object. The material substance is not static, it is in perpetual transformation. Consider a vessel designed to hold water. It is routinely referred to as a cup. Yet, the material constituting this vessel is in constant motion. Individual atoms shift position, bind and release, their electrical charges fluctuating. The arrangement of these atoms changes with temperature and pressure. Microscopic damage accumulates through use. The apparent solidity is a composite of ongoing alterations. The cup is not a fixed entity, it is a transient arrangement of particles. This alteration is not confined to specific materials. It applies to all perceived objects. The stone, the cloud, the living organism, all exist within the framework of ceaseless change. The continuous reordering of constituent elements contradicts the foundational assumption of inherent stability. To attempt to define an essence, a core identity, is to attempt to capture something that is, by its very nature, ephemeral. The discomfort arising from this recognition originates from the dissonance between perceived stability and demonstrable change. The experience of dissatisfaction is not inherent to existence, but stems from the clinging to a false premise. The belief in an enduring essence creates a framework for expectation that is inevitably undermined by observation. Therefore, the object, as perceived, is not a thing possessing an inherent essence. It is a process, a sequence of events unfolding. The designation object remains a functional label, useful for navigation, but ultimately lacking correspondence to an underlying reality. The perceived stability dissolves into the continuous flow of alteration. The pursuit of satisfaction, as a foundational human impulse, appears straightforward. Discomfort registers, and action is taken to diminish it. Pleasure arises, it is registered as desirable. The pattern repeats, creating an illusion of reliable cause and effect. This generates the assumption that satisfaction, once attained, can remain. The appeal of this assumption is evident. The body signals distress, and relief arrives. A desired outcome occurs, and it feels good. This sequence reinforces the idea that similar actions, repeated consistently, will invariably produce similar results. The experience of temporary cessation of discomfort validates the trajectory. The logical extension is that permanence is achievable. This perspective establishes a framework for expectations. Actions are evaluated based on their capacity to generate satisfaction. Absence of satisfaction becomes a problem to be solved. Environments are judged by their ability to provide for the continued experience of satisfaction. The entire world is measured against the backdrop of this assumed possibility. The maintenance of this assumption is not solely a product of individual experience. Cultural narratives consistently portray satisfaction as an achievable goal. Systems of reward and punishment shape behavior, implicitly promising the continuation of pleasurable outcomes if certain conditions are met. Social structures are built upon the belief that satisfaction is a stable and sustainable condition. However, the very act of pursuing satisfaction reveals a contradiction. To desire satisfaction is to acknowledge the possibility of its absence. The seeking implies a previous lack, and the subsequent attainment implies a previous presence. If satisfaction could be permanently obtained, the need to seek it would cease. The seeking itself is evidence against the claim of permanence. The lifespan of any phenomenon is finite. All things arise, persist for a time, and then cease. This process applies to sensation, to feeling, and to the conditions that generate them. Satisfaction, therefore, is not an exception. It is contingent. It is dependent on ever-changing circumstances. Its existence is predicated on its eventual non-existence. The belief in permanent satisfaction necessitates a denial of this fundamental truth. It requires a blindness to the continuous flux of experience. It demands an insistence on stability, where only change exists. This insistence creates a dependency on conditions that are inherently unstable. The discomfort of seeking satisfaction is compounded by the inevitable disappointment. The assumption of permanence is repeatedly undermined by the reality of cessation. The pursuit becomes a cycle of hope and disillusionment, reinforcing the very dissatisfaction it seeks to eliminate. The reliance on satisfaction as a benchmark for value creates an unsustainable foundation. The recognition that satisfaction is inherently impermanent does not negate its value, it simply recontextualizes it. It dissolves the expectation of permanence, revealing the illusion upon which it rested. The assumption collapses under the weight of its own contradiction, leaving only the continuous arising and passing of phenomena. The sense of being persists. It is an undeniable experience, a constant presence within the flow of perception. This feeling informs all action, dictates choice, and provides a foundational understanding of existence. It seems reasonable to assume that this feeling corresponds to something, a self, a core identity, a permanent and unified entity. This assumption, however, proves to be a misapprehension when subjected to careful scrutiny. The perception of continuity is paramount to this mistaken assumption. Consciousness does not cease, it transitions from one moment to the next. Experiences arrive, remain for a duration, and then dissolve, leaving space for the subsequent experience. This unbroken sequence fosters the belief in an unchanging subject, an observer that remains the same despite the constant change of what is observed. The narrative readily reinforces this impression. Language, in its structure, requires a subject. The pronoun I is unavoidable in articulating experience. The very act of describing generates a sense of ownership, attributing the sensation to a stable point of reference. This narrative is built upon memory. The capacity to recall past events creates the illusion of a continuous past, connecting the present self to a previous version. These remembered experiences form a chain, linking one moment to the next, reinforcing the belief in a persistent identity. The accumulation of these memories, these recollections, solidifies the perception of a self that has existed and will continue to exist. Yet, closer inspection reveals a different truth. The experiences themselves are not fixed, they are processes, arising and passing away. Thoughts emerge, linger, and then vanish. Sensations manifest, remain briefly, and then subside. Feelings arise, fluctuate, and then disappear. Each of these states is impermanent, arising dependent on conditions and ceasing when those conditions change. The feeling of being is not a thing, but a process, a sequence of fleeting phenomena. The I, to which these experiences are attributed, is therefore not a foundational entity, but an aggregation of these temporary states. It is a convenient designation for the collection of mental and physical processes occurring at any given moment. It is a descriptor applied to a flow, not a static object within it. The feeling of agency, the sense of being the controller of action, is also similarly dependent. Actions occur seemingly originating from this I, but those actions themselves are dependent on countless prior causes. The dissatisfaction that arises is not an inherent fault in experience itself. It emerges from the persistent clinging to the mistaken assumption of a unified self. The expectation that this self should remain stable, permanent, and unchanging leads to frustration when the reality of constant flux is encountered. The desire to preserve this illusory self creates suffering. The belief in its inherent importance gives rise to attachment. The appearance of continuity is thus a skillful deception, a construction built upon impermanent foundations. There is no underlying substance, no enduring essence. The sense of being diminishes as the conditional nature of experience becomes clear. It dissolves into the very flow from which it arose, leaving only the succession of moments. The sense of separation, the awareness of this existing distinct from that, is a foundational condition. It allows for the straightforward identification of objects, the navigation of space, the recognition of difference. Without it, interaction with the environment would be chaotic, impossible. The very act of reaching for a cup requires the understanding that the hand is separate from the cup, that the hand can act upon the cup. This initial distinction facilitates all subsequent action. This perceived separation, however, is not an inherent quality. It is a construction. Conceptual frameworks, the internalized structures through which understanding is processed, depend on these divisions. Language itself operates through them. Words demarcate and label, inherently creating boundaries where perhaps none existed prior to naming. Consider the designation of tree. A collection of wood, leaf, root, and soil blends into a continuum, a complex interplay of elements. The word tree pulls a segment from this flow, defining it as a discrete entity. The experience of dissatisfaction often arises from an attachment to this assumed separation. The desire for permanence, for the solidity of this, generates an anxiety concerning its potential loss or alteration. When this changes, the grief experienced is a direct consequence of believing in its inherent, stable existence. The desire to protect this from that leads to conflict, to the reinforcement of artificial divisions. The pursuit of self, of a bounded identity, is similarly rooted in this foundational error. Observe how this framework operates. The brain categorizes, sorting information into discrete packets. The immediate sensation of warmth is classified as sunlight, which is then filed under present. This process simplifies reality, facilitating rapid response, but simultaneously obscures the interconnectedness of the phenomena. What we experience as sunlight is merely one facet of an immense energetic exchange. To label it, to isolate it, is to miss the totality of the event. The insistence on separation dictates how we relate to the world. We measure, we quantify, we define parameters. A river is not merely flowing water, it is a resource to be managed, a border to be controlled. Mountains are not simply geological formations, they are obstacles to be overcome, resources to be exploited. The landscape, viewed through the lens of separation, becomes a collection of things to be manipulated. The system sustains itself. The more we reinforce these boundaries, the more real they appear. A child learns to differentiate between mine and yours, solidifying the concept of individual ownership. These seemingly practical distinctions become ingrained patterns of thought, shaping perceptions and influencing behavior. Yet, a closer examination reveals that these boundaries are contingent, dependent on the frameworks that establish them. The notion of mine dissolves when shared, when relinquished, when considered within a larger context of interdependence. The recognition of this dependence does not negate the utility of differentiation. The ability to distinguish between danger and safety remains vital. It simply exposes the underlying presumption upon which that distinction is built. The separation persists as a convenient tool, a functional adaptation, not a fundamental truth. It is a map, not the territory. The map dissolves. The world appears solid. Things exist. A table is a table, identifiable, separate. This perception forms the ground of ordinary understanding. It seems undeniably real, the foundation upon which we build our experience. It is a necessary framework for navigating the immediate environment. Without it, action becomes chaotic. Relationships dissolve into meaningless interaction. This assumption that discrete entities possess inherent existence arises from the apparent stability of perception. We observe a phenomenon, we label it, and we expect that label to consistently apply. The table remains a table, regardless of who observes it. This perceived consistency fosters a sense of certainty, which in turn underpins our causal reasoning. We infer that if A happens, then B will follow, because A and B reliably linked. Discomfort arises when this presumed stability falters. The table, subjected to heat or water, alters. It cracks, it warps, it decays. What the table, identifiable and separate, now transforms. It is no longer precisely what it seemed. This incongruity produces a subtle unease. We experience a gap between expectation and reality. It is a momentary tremor in the foundation of our understanding. Accumulating over time, these tremors contribute to a pervasive dissatisfaction. The insistence on inherent existence requires a denial of underlying processes. The table's form depends upon the arrangement of molecules, the type of wood, the humidity in the air. Each of these factors contributes to its appearance. Each factor is impermanent, change is inherent to all conditions. The apparent solidity is a temporary manifestation. It exists only as a confluence of causes, none of which possesses inherent existence itself. Consider a flame. It appears as a distinct entity, burning with a characteristic luminosity. However, the flame is entirely reliant on the presence of fuel, oxygen, and a source of ignition. Remove any one of these conditions and the flame ceases. It never existed independently of those supporting factors. The flame is not a self-contained, enduring thing. It is an arising and passing away. This pattern extends beyond physical objects. Thoughts, feelings, even our sense of self are similarly dependent. They are conditioned by prior experiences, current circumstances, and biological processes. They are not fixed or permanent. They are patterns of arising and cessation. They, too, depend upon conditions. The insistence on inherent existence blinds us to this dynamic interplay. The continued reliance on this assumption is perpetuated by the desire for predictability. We crave a world where cause and effect are reliable, where outcomes are certain. Inherent existence offers that illusion. But that certainty is an invention, a construct erected upon a flawed premise. The solidity we experience is not a fundamental property, but a consequence of our perceptual filters and our ingrained modes of thought. The examination of causality itself reveals the fallacy. A thing does not simply, it arises, it continues for a time, and then it ceases. This is the fundamental law. It is not a constraint, but a description of reality. There is no independent substance that persists through this process. There is only change. It is the consistent observation of that change which undermines the notion of inherent existence. It demonstrates a lack of grounding. It weakens the premise. The solidity dissolves. The impulse to secure an object originates from a belief that securing it will guarantee retention. This belief exists as a foundational premise. It dictates action. It shapes expectation. The logic appears straightforward. Possession leads to continued possession. The desire for sustenance, for shelter, for companionship reinforces this presumption. The natural inclination to preserve what is perceived as beneficial fuels its persistence. The assumption functions within a cycle. A perceived benefit motivates a securing action. The resulting proximity fosters a sense of assurance. This assurance reinforces the original belief that securing leads to retention. The cycle perpetuates itself. It creates an illusion of permanence where none exists. Dissatisfaction arises when the inevitable parting occurs. The parting challenges the presumed causality. It instigates a search for fault, a questioning of strategy. The feeling of loss constitutes the primary dissatisfaction. It is not the absence of the object that causes distress, but the disruption of the assumed causal link. Retention was expected, absence is the deviation. The intensity of the distress is proportional to the perceived value initially assigned to the object. The greater the investment of expectation, the more profound the resulting disappointment. The perceived security granted by securing is conditional. It is dependent on external factors beyond inherent control. The object itself is subject to decay, to displacement, to alteration. The environment is likewise unstable. Forces operate outside of and independently of the securing action. These forces erode the foundation of assumed retention. The very act of securing, of attempting to hold, introduces a dynamic that counteracts the intention. Consider a hand grasping a flower. The flower's beauty is appreciated. The desire to maintain that beauty arises. The hand closes. The act of grasping, intended to preserve, damages the flower. The petals bruise. The stem bends. The flower's beauty diminishes precisely because of the action intended to retain it. The securing action itself compromises the object it sought to protect. The persistence of this assumption is sustained by a learned association. Repeated experiences of securing objects, followed by their eventual loss, reinforce the belief despite the contradictory outcome. The sequence becomes ingrained. It is understood as a pattern, albeit a flawed one. The association between grasping and security, between possession and permanence, strengthens with each repetition. This learned behavior solidifies the misconception. It obscures the fundamental truth of impermanence. The assumption does not require examination in terms of psychological origin. The questioning of the origin distracts from the essential point. The point is the assumption itself, the operating premise that securing guarantees retention. To pursue the source of the belief is to enter a secondary layer of analysis, irrelevant to dismantling the initial misconception. It is to shift focus from the faulty structure to the hypothetical building blocks. The idea that securing an object will ensure its retention dissolves upon observation of the impermanent nature of all phenomena. The sensation of losing control is frequently accompanied by aversion. This aversion arises not from the event itself, but from the valuation placed upon control. We register a shift, a movement away from a state we have designated as desirable, and react accordingly. The aversion is itself a secondary phenomenon, a consequence of prior evaluation. This valuation occurs because control correlates with predictability. Predictability, in turn, is often associated with safety. A perceived degree of control allows for the anticipation of outcomes, the mitigation of potential threat. The logic is straightforward. It exists within the framework of habitual thought. The framework is not innate, it is constructed. Conditioning plays a crucial role in the formation of this assumption. Reward reinforces behaviors that maintain a sense of control. Punishment discourages actions that disrupt it. These experiences shape our understanding of the world, embedding the value of control deep within our patterns of response. Societal expectations further solidify this valuation. Social structures are predicated on order, on the ability to anticipate and regulate behavior. Deviation from established norms, any relinquishing of assumed control, is often met with disapproval, with consequence. The pressure to conform reinforces the desire to maintain a semblance of control over oneself and one's environment. The desire for security fuels the assumption. Security is sought through the minimization of risk. Control is presented as a mechanism for risk reduction. This presentation is accepted without rigorous examination. The connection between control and security becomes a given, a foundational belief. Yet, the connection is conditional. The assumption of control is not a universal truth. It is a construct dependent on specific circumstances. All things are subject to change. Everything is in flux. This flux manifests as the dissolution of conditions, the impermanence of form. Control, by its very nature, exists within a matrix of conditions. When those conditions shift, the perceived control dissolves. The dissolution is not inherently negative. It is the nature of existence. The aversion triggered by this dissolution is not a response to an objective harm. It is a reaction to a disrupted expectation, a crumbling of a constructed edifice. The feeling of loss is a product of the mind's attachment to a temporary state. The cessation of aversion does not require effort. It requires only the observation of the assumption itself. The assumption appears valid because it is consistently reinforced. It appears undesirable because it is associated with aversion. It exists as a pattern, a habitual way of understanding experience. Recognizing this pattern does not alter the experience of dissolution. It does not prevent the loss of perceived control. It simply removes the layer of aversion that obscures the event itself. The event remains, a shift in conditions, a movement within impermanence. The assumption, once examined, loses its grip. The sensation remains, but the aversion recedes. This sensation will continue to arise as conditions continue to shift. The assumption operates within the individual's perception, a belief that expectation aligns with reality. It is a pervasive framework, structuring engagement with the environment. This alignment appears demonstrable in routine circumstances. Daily events often unfold as anticipated. Systems function as predicted. Interactions proceed according to established patterns. The experience reinforces the initial assumption. The appearance of alignment is not absolute. It is dependent upon specific conditions. The conditions are frequently met, but they are not universal. The frequency reinforces the mistaken belief, despite instances where the alignment fails. These failures are registered, but their significance is often diminished. The persistent sense of predictability outweighs the occasional deviation. Habitual actions contribute to the perpetuation of the assumption. Routines require predictable outcomes. Learned associations link actions to expected results. Cognitive biases filter information, prioritizing data that supports the existing framework. The framework becomes self-sustaining. It resists evidence to the contrary. It resists a wider consideration of the possibilities. Reality does not conform to the rigid structure of expectation. Reality is characterized by constant change. Elements shift, processes evolve, and conditions fluctuate. This inherent flux introduces variations. The variations deviate from the anticipated order. The difference between expectation and reality generates dissonance. Dissonance is the felt inconsistency. It is a disturbance within the perceptual framework. The assumption is reliant upon a static understanding of reality. It presupposes a degree of permanence that does not exist. The greater the investment in the expectation, the more pronounced the dissonance when it fails. The dissonance is not a failure of reality, it is a failure of the expectation. It is a consequence of projecting a fixed form onto a fluid process. The dissonance demonstrates the provisional nature of the initial assumption. It reveals the conditional basis of perceived order. The assumption itself does not vanish with the realization. It continues to operate within the individual's perception. The dissonance diminishes as the inherent variance in reality is acknowledged. The understanding of variance does not necessitate a new assumption. It simply permits a more accurate appraisal of what is. The assumption dissolves into observation. The persistence of perceived objects creates a framework. Within this framework, phenomena appear to possess inherent existence. This assumption is foundational to many experiences. It is the basis for categorizing, labeling, and reacting to the world. It allows for a feeling of solidity, of something there. This feeling reinforces the initial assumption. It manifests as a stability in perception. A chair remains a chair, regardless of whether one looks at it or not. A tree persists even when unobserved. This perceived constancy strengthens the notion of an independent self, a distinct thing. This apparent permanence drives causal reasoning. We observe events and connect them through cause and effect. The chair supports weight. The tree provides shade. These connections require a stable subject to act and be acted upon. Without inherent existence, the very structure of causation falters. The logic of action presupposes a lasting actor. The naturalization of experience solidifies this conviction. We come to expect things to be as they appear. The world presents itself as a collection of distinct entities. This expectation becomes normalized, a baseline against which all experience is measured. Discrepancies are dismissed as anomalies, exceptional cases. The underlying assumption remains unquestioned. The appearance of a solid, independent object rests upon conditions. It is contingent. The chair is the result of wood, labor, design, and the surrounding environment. Remove these conditions, and the chair ceases to exist as a chair. Similarly, the tree is dependent on soil, water, sunlight, and a complex ecosystem. Alter these conditions, and the tree transforms or disappears. The tree's existence is not its own. It does not create itself. It is a confluence of interconnected factors, each relying on others. The chair's form derives entirely from its constituent parts and the forces that brought them together. Neither entity possesses an inherent, self-contained nature. Their continued existence is subject to constant flux. Consider the moment of origination. A particular tree arises from a seed, itself the product of previous generations. The seed requires specific conditions to germinate. Those conditions are themselves dependent on prior circumstances. To trace the lineage back reveals a chain of causes, extending indefinitely. There is no point at which an independent entity can be isolated. This is true for every perceived object. It is true for the chair, the tree, and the perceiving mind itself. Each is a temporary assemblage, a fleeting manifestation of interdependent processes. The stability perceived is an illusion, a consequence of observing only a small segment of an immensely complex web. The feeling of solidity dissipates when this understanding is acknowledged. The framework of inherent existence weakens. The chair is not fundamentally a chair, but a momentary expression of interwoven conditions. The tree is not an independent entity, but a transient point in a chain of causation. The separation fades. The world is seen as a continuum of arising and passing away. The perception of distinct objects ceases to hold its prior conviction. The world appears solid. It seems to present itself directly for observation. This presentation feels certain, a foundation for all understanding. The feeling of certainty is pervasive because interaction with the world necessitates it. We navigate by assumed accuracy. We build upon the presumption that what is perceived. This presumption arises from a basic operational requirement. Movement demands prediction. Action requires a degree of reliable sensory input. Without some approximation of correspondence, existence would be untenable. Yet this operational necessity has ossified into a fundamental assumption about reality. We assume that perception accurately reflects the world. Consider the act of seeing. Light registers on the surface, initiating a cascade of electrochemical events. These events are translated, processed, and ultimately interpreted. The interpretation is not a passive reception. It is an active construction reliant on pre-existing frameworks. These frameworks consist of learned patterns, habitual responses, and culturally transmitted conventions. The brain seeks order. It imposes structure. Conceptual categories are fundamental to this ordering process. We categorize color, shape, size, texture. We assign names and attributes. These categories facilitate recognition, allowing for efficient interaction. However, they also impose a rigid architecture upon a reality that is inherently fluid. A sunset is not simply red or orange. It is a gradient, a constantly shifting blend. The categorization diminishes the experience, flattening the spectrum. The assumption of accurate reflection reinforces itself. Repeated exposure to a categorized world strengthens the associated neural pathways. Each perception is validated by the already established framework. Discrepancies are smoothed over, dismissed as anomalies, or reinterpreted to fit the prevailing narrative. This creates a feedback loop, solidifying the original assumption. It becomes not a hypothesis to be tested, but a bedrock of experience. The consequence of this assumption is dissatisfaction. The perceived solidity of the world breeds attachment. Attachment leads to aversion when the perceived solidity is challenged. A cherished object breaks. A relationship ends. The familiar landscape changes. The world does not conform to the expectations generated by the assumption. The dissonance produces unease. The assumption's validity is contingent. It rests upon the stability of the frameworks that support it. These frameworks are not innate. They are acquired, learned, and transmitted. They are subject to cultural variation and individual interpretation. They change over time. A child's understanding of color differs from that of an adult. A scientist's understanding differs from that of a poet. All are products of specific conditioning. The brain actively filters and interprets sensory data. This filtering is necessary for efficient processing, but it also introduces a layer of distortion. The dynamic flow of experience is reduced to discrete, manageable units. The impermanence of all things is obscured by the illusion of stability. The interconnectedness of existence is masked by the emphasis on individual, separate objects. The feeling of certainty fades. The edifice of presumed accuracy dissolves. There is simply the ongoing process of sensation, unburdened by the weight of categorization. Nothing remains to be observed. The feeling of being a self arises from recognizable patterns. These patterns manifest as predictable behaviors, consistent beliefs, and habitual responses to experience. This is not an unusual occurrence. It is how the illusion of identity solidifies. The feeling of being a self appears stable because these patterns repeat. They are reinforced through experience, solidifying the impression of an enduring foundation. Narratives are constructed to explain and justify these patterns, creating a story of who one is. The accumulation of these elements produces the sensation of a continuous, definable self. The persistent feeling of dissatisfaction frequently accompanies this sense of identity. This is not a consequence of external conditions alone. It stems from the inherent limitations of the patterns themselves. The patterns define boundaries. They limit the scope of experience to what aligns with their established framework. When experience deviates, a sense of discomfort arises. The self, defined by the patterns, resists change, perceiving it as a threat. This resistance creates friction between the individual and the world. The expectation of consistency generates frustration when faced with the unavoidable realities of difference. The apparent stability of these patterns is a product of repeated observation, not an intrinsic quality. The patterns exist because they are continually reproduced. Each action, each thought, reinforces the existing structure. This reproduction is conditional. It depends on ongoing processes and external influences. The initial formation of a pattern relies on prior conditions. Its maintenance requires the continued presence of those conditions. Alterations in circumstances disrupt the pattern's reproduction. New influences introduce variations. The feeling of self, predicated on these patterns, begins to waver. The patterns are not static entities. They are constantly shifting, albeit subtly. Every moment introduces a new element, however insignificant. These elements interact with existing patterns, causing slight adjustments. These adjustments are often imperceptible within the larger framework of the perceived self. Yet they accumulate. Over time, the patterns that initially defined identity are demonstrably altered. The consistency that once seemed absolute is revealed as a temporary arrangement. The narratives constructed to explain the self no longer fully align with the underlying reality. The feeling of being a self, predicated on predictable patterns, cannot withstand the recognition of this constant flux. The insistence on continuity fails to account for the ceaseless alteration. The foundations crumble not with a sudden collapse, but with the gradual dissolution of the premise upon which they were built. The expectation of a stable identity is abandoned as an untenable fiction. The feeling of being a self ceases to be. The cessation of this feeling is itself an event, subject to its own impermanence. The feeling persists that change signifies loss. This initial assessment seems reasonable. Something exists, a form or state. Then that form or state ceases. The absence is registered as a reduction, a diminution. It is a simple equation, readily understood. Dissolution is equated with subtraction. This equation generates dissatisfaction. The cessation of something valued creates discomfort. The discomfort intensifies if the valuation is considerable. A significant object vanishes. The corresponding feeling is a palpable depletion. The feeling compounds with further change. Each disappearance reinforces the core belief that change inherently diminishes. The belief itself depends upon a prior condition. The condition is a grasping. It is not a physical grasp, but a mental holding. The holding is an investment in the permanence of a particular state. This investment dictates that any departure is a negative event. The absence of the expected state is experienced as a deficit. Without this investment, the cessation would be merely an event. Consider a familiar building. It stands for many years. People become accustomed to its presence. They rely upon its structure, its function. It is a constant in their experience. The building is then scheduled for demolition. The people anticipate a loss. The building's absence will fundamentally alter their surroundings. This is a logical conclusion, given the previous condition of dependence. However, the demolition is not inherently negative. It is simply an occurrence. The building was never permanent. Its existence was temporary, contingent. The feeling of loss originates from the prior attachment to its permanence. The attachment colors the event, transforming it into a subtraction. Were there no attachment, there would be only a shift. The attachment requires a further assumption. The assumption is that the existing state is desirable. Without this underlying judgment, the change would be neutral. The shift would not trigger a negative response. The judgment reinforces the sense of loss, solidifying the initial equation. The equation dictates that change represents a reduction in value. This entire framework rests upon the prior understanding that something can truly be possessed. The building, the relationship, the memory. These are impermanent phenomena. They exist within a constant flow. To attempt to hold them, to guarantee their continued existence, is to misunderstand their nature. To mistake this misunderstanding as a fundamental truth is to perpetuate suffering. The equation breaks down upon examination. The original feeling dissipates, revealing only the event. The event simply is. The pervasive sense that acquisition provides fulfillment is a foundational error. It appears reasonable because desire initiates action. Action often culminates in the possession of something sought. This sequence generates a perceived causality. We observe desire, then attainment, then a brief elevation of feeling. This elevation is misinterpreted as inherent satisfaction. The feeling itself is not inherently satisfying. It is a consequence of an expectation. That expectation dictates a positive outcome following acquisition. When the expectation is met, a fleeting sensation arises. This sensation is incorrectly equated with lasting contentment. It is not. It is a temporary realignment of conditions. Societal structures reinforce this assumption. Systems of production and exchange are predicated on the constant generation of desire. Advertising, consumerism, and cultural narratives consistently link external objects with internal states of well-being. These narratives establish a framework within which craving appears logical. The logic is predicated on the assumption of inherent fulfillment. Biological drives contribute to the error. The instinct for survival, for reproduction, manifests as craving. These drives, initially focused on fundamental needs, become generalized through conditioning. The expansion of desire beyond necessity creates a cycle. The cycle perpetuates itself through the recurrent association of acquisition and feeling. Personal history further entrenches the assumption. Individual experiences shape preferences. Past successes in obtaining desired outcomes strengthen the belief that future acquisitions will produce similar results. Failures to attain desires do not dismantle the underlying assumption. They are rationalized as temporary setbacks. These rationalizations preserve the core belief. The assumption's validity is conditional. It depends on the continued belief that external objects can generate internal states. This belief is not universally held. It is a product of specific cultural and personal conditioning. It is not an intrinsic truth. Recognizing this dependency destabilizes the entire framework. The examination of interconnectedness reveals the fallacy. All phenomena are interdependent. Nothing exists in isolation. The feeling associated with acquisition is itself a product of countless factors. These factors include the producer of the object, the transportation network, the individual's own history, and countless other variables. Attributing the feeling to the object itself is a simplification. The transient nature of all things also undermines the assumption. Objects change, deteriorate, and cease to exist. The feelings associated with them are likewise impermanent. This impermanence contradicts the notion of lasting fulfillment. A fleeting sensation cannot provide enduring satisfaction. The entire structure collapses when the initial assumption is questioned. The perceived causality between desire and well-being dissolves. The feeling itself remains. It is simply no longer interpreted as a product of acquisition. It is a sensation, one among many, arising and passing away. The mistaken assumption is revealed as a construct. It ceases to function. Experience simply unfolds. The conviction that stability arises from grasping is a foundational error. It feels initially like a simple equation. Something is held and therefore it is secure. The sensation of control, however fleeting, reinforces this belief. A hand closes around an object, a position is defended, a narrative is solidified. The feeling of stability appears to be the direct consequence of this action. This perceived connection is predicated on a fundamental misunderstanding of the nature of reality. What is grasped is itself subject to change. The object itself degrades, the position shifts, the narrative dissolves. The act of grasping does not negate these processes, it merely postpones their inevitable arrival. The feeling of security is therefore an illusion, a temporary postponement of an unavoidable event. The impetus to grasp originates from a desire to avoid instability. Dissatisfaction arises precisely because the object of the grasp remains fundamentally unstable. The initial feeling of security dissolves into anxiety when the impermanence of what is held becomes apparent. The grasp tightens, a reflexive response to perceived threat. Yet, the very act of tightening reinforces the illusion, generating more anxiety when the inevitable loosening occurs. This cyclical dynamic perpetuates itself. The initial fear of instability prompts grasping, which produces temporary security, which dissolves into renewed fear, which triggers further grasping. This loop forms a self-sustaining system, a continuous production of dissatisfaction. The more intensely the grasp, the greater the subsequent disappointment when the object of the grasp alters. The attempt to control an inherently uncontrollable thing generates a corresponding measure of unease. The assumption that stability can be achieved through grasping is sustained by habitual behaviors. Actions repeated over time form patterns of response. The pattern of grasping becomes a default reaction to any perceived threat to security. This is not a conscious choice, but a learned response, deeply ingrained in the mechanisms of interaction with the world. The reinforcement of this behavior solidifies the mistaken assumption, making it increasingly difficult to recognize as erroneous. The reliance on grasping also depends on the expectation of permanence. The desire for things to remain as they are contributes to the perception that stability is desirable and achievable. This expectation generates discomfort when change occurs. The discomfort then reinforces the urge to grasp and retain, further perpetuating the cycle. The expectation itself is contingent, a projection based on a limited experience of the world. The sensation of control is not an inherent property of grasping. It is a feeling generated by the mind, a cognitive interpretation of a physical action. The feeling is dependent on the continued presence of both the hand and the object. Remove either, and the feeling vanishes. The absence of the feeling does not necessarily indicate an absence of suffering, but it does reveal the precariousness of the association. The conviction that stability can be achieved through grasping dissolves.